the notion of infinite universes, multiverse, is the most intellectually rubbish idea that has possibly ever come. The only reason people think like that is because the model of the universe they have to handle this universe doesn't work. So they'll go, it doesn't work, but if we have infinite number of universes, it maybe works. And you're like, oh, shut up. Why not just say a leprechaun's done it or something? Because that at least would be more fun. The infinite universes means like I can't be bothered coming up with a genuinely good rational explanation, so I'm just going to do Deus Ex Machina and go, well, you know, I'm just going to go, oh, there's infinite universes and it will be true in one of them. And you're like, oh, you lazy good for nothing. And as you say, it doesn't only ruin science and scientific explanation, because it's so rubbish in that, but it's rubbish for storytelling.
Hello, Reformed mythologist Nate Morgan-Locke here with an interview. Yes, that's right. It's not just going to be me talking in this video. I'm going to be joined by the Revd Dr Paul Blackham. The particular thing that made me think I really want to get you onto the Reformed Mythologist channel to talk about is the most wonderfully named podcast I think that's ever existed, the Christ-Centered Cosmic Civilization podcast, which is a fairly new thing from you. Just give us an understanding of what is the Christ-Centered Cosmic Civilization podcast all about.
Yeah, so I ended up with that name just because I kept... I needed something really big that would enable me to talk about all the things that I wanted to talk about. That it wasn't as if I said, oh, I just want to do something about like how to understand the Bible, or something about angels, or something about science. Mm-hmm. I was like, one of the big things that I've been sort of concerned about is that like there's quite good things about little portions of truth and reality, but I felt like what the need is, at least for me, and that's what I feel I've missed, and this has particularly come from looking back at Christian history, Christian civilizations all over the world for thousands of years, is that they have this massive view of reality, and they can do that by having this sense of Jesus Christ, the divine emperor, who reigns over this cosmic civilization. And then with that vision of Christ, I think the problem is a lot of people have a view of Jesus, and it's really just personal salvation. And it's like, Jesus saves me. And then, well, what about Jesus? And I'm looking out the window, that tree, or that car, or that house, or the grass over there, or whatever. Oh, no, I don't know. That's got nothing to do with Jesus. He's the savior person. He's selling fire insurance, eternal fire insurance, maybe a little bit more than that, a little bit. But basically, that's the scope. And I'm like, that's rubbish. This cosmic high priest that's Jesus. So how can we talk? Because I, over the years, have been spent a lot of time looking how Jesus makes sense of everything: music, science, biology, chemistry, physics, language, architecture, everything, geography, history, angels, all these different animals, trees, all of it. And that I just thought, what, I need a heading that enabled me to talk about all those things, and to do it in a sort of slightly unhurried way. So it's not as if I'm like, this week I'm going to do everything on like maths. It's like, I don't know how long maths is. Well, I do now because I finished maths. But it took at least sort of 6 episodes, I think, 6 or 7 episodes to kind of go, right, maths, how numbers, let's give that not exhaustive, but enough to feel, I kind of feel we've got a handle on that. Why that is all about Jesus. And then we're into all the different subjects.
Well, so that's one of the things whenever anyone's trying to start a podcast, I mean, it's one of those things that people start and then it's very difficult to sort of sustain it. And one of the challenges people find is how do you carve out your niche? Like what's your thing? What are you not talking about on your podcast so that your audience can actually find you and that sort of thing. Whereas when you set it up exactly as you've done, it's like the cosmic civilization of Christ. Like literally, that is everything. There isn't anything that can be possibly outside of the rule of the divine emperor, as you sort of refer to him. And that is one of the things that I found really exciting about it, is that it's a total perspective on, if I say I'm the Reformed mythologist, well, you're a sort of cosmologist. It's like, what's in the scope of this podcast and everything. And I want to dive into some of the specifics of the episodes that you've done so far. But one thing I like to do as somebody who's fascinated by story and storytelling is to try and think, well, how can we get to know you a little bit before we, get into, how Jesus helps us to understand maths or music or the Fey creatures. We'll get onto that. Is to try to sum you up in 3 scenes. Is this possible? If we were making Paul Blackham the movie, the first question always comes, who do you think would play you? Who could do justice to you in a movie? And then really, if you can just take us to 3 scenes so that we can get you. If we wanted to really understand you, what would those 3 scenes be?
The 3 scenes. The actor thing's difficult because, I'm not sure there's anybody quite suitable. It'd have to be balding, aged, and anyway.
Prosthetics. They can do all sorts of prosthetics. You can have anyone you like,
Yeah, okay, possibly Brian Blessed or something. But anyway, with the 3 scenes, I guess one scene that might come to mind is like me as like probably about 13, 14 years of age. And there was a newish minister in Methodist background, and we were primitive Methodists. That's a literal thing. Primitive Methodism meant it was a kind of movement in the 19th century because it was the feeling Methodism had drifted away from its roots and it was too complicated. Primitive Methodism was like, we got to go back to the way it was like 100 years ago and be serious. So primitive Methodism grew up then, and we were that. Right. And then we had a minister who came who was a Wesleyan minister, and that meant that he was higher church, sacramental. Mm-hmm. And at first we were like, oh, what's all this about? We don't fancy this.
Dodgy.
And he wore a robe, like a Geneva preaching gown, and immediately we were like, oh, this is not primitive to me. But he introduced me to what he did is he gave us the Christian year and said, we're going to do the Christian year. Okay. And he was so into it. And then when we hit like Advent or the run up to Easter, he'd do readings from the church fathers. And again, we're like, saints? What's all this rubbish? And then we listened, and me especially as that young teenager, I was like, oh, he's reading people who are sort of scratching and itches that I've had. Okay. And I've been wanting answers to those sorts of questions. And I'm thinking, like, why does Jesus have to be resurrected? Doesn't his death do everything? What is achieved by him rising from the dead? And then these people would say that, the people he'd read. And I was like, whoa, this is so good. So that was, and then there was like an excitement. And I can remember times running up to Christmas and Easter, like Christmas Eve going for Holy Communion or Easter going for a Good Friday meditation. And I'd be crying with the excitement and wonder as a young teenager, just like, I can't wait to hear more of this. So that's one scene.
So what year is this taking place?
So that's the early 80s.
Okay. Yeah. So early 80s. Okay. Yeah. In what part of the country?
That's Lancashire. That's like if you think of Blackpool and you go down the coast from Blackpool, and then there's the Ribble estuary, and then so on one side you've got Morecambe and Blackpool and that sort of thing. Opposite that you've got Southport, and then going up to Preston and things like that. So I'm between Southport and Preston, on the sort of the bank of the river the Ribble estuary there, and it's a farming area.
Yeah.
Lancashire. Yeah.
So early 80s, and you're having your mind sort of just expanded in terms of the scope of who Jesus is and what it means that Jesus has sort of come. And
that was huge for me because I'd read a lot of the Bible, and I only really read, for me, reading the Bible meant reading Moses. Like, I just would start at the beginning, read it, quite enjoyed Joshua, loved Moses.
Right.
Read Joshua, I was like, that's okay. And then Jesus is all right. And then once I got into, I'd be like, oh, and and it's not as good. And then instead of saying, which a lot of people, I think, now I know, people would go, oh, let's just go to the New Testament, read the Gospels and things. I was like, I'll just go back to the beginning and start again. And I can remember just doing that repetitively as a younger kid, before my teens, just over and over and over, and then in my teens. But then added to that mix was this, church year, sacramental perspective, early church fathers, things like that. And it was really, it's huge.
Were you sort of anxious about your faith or your standing before God in that? Because a lot of the time when people have a kind of teenage experience that they, this was really what did it for me, it's often to do with sort of anxiety about am I saved or not, and then it sort of but then it all suddenly made sense and I had peace. But it sounds as though you sort of had the peace, but you just felt that your vision of Christ was narrower than it maybe ought to have been.
I literally can't remember a time when I didn't trust in Jesus. Literally, I'll share this. It's a crazy thing, and you'll say it can't be true. But I literally, my very earliest memory is being held in the arms of my mum at a harvest festival service, literally in the first year of my life.
Okay.
Like 1970 or something like that. And then I had it, it's very clear in my mind, this service. And then when we looked it up, it was in the first year of my life. There was such a service just as I remembered it. And so I cannot remember a time when I didn't believe all this and trust in it and belong to it. So, I mean, as a teenager, I was badly behaved, terrible discipleship, all that sort of thing.
Right.
And of course, that was bad, needed to be sorted out, and made a little bit of progress perhaps since then. But the sense of what is true, what is real, what is to hold on to, what really matters. I can't remember a time when I wasn't gripped by it and gripping it.
Yeah. That's wonderful, and such an encouragement for those of us who do have believers with children who are sort of bringing them up in the faith. It's not by necessity that you just have to have this kind of I didn't understand a single thing. It didn't make any sense at all. I had no relationship with Jesus whatsoever until I went away as a teenager or something. But yeah, that's so encouraging. So you were celebrating harvest festivals then? There was a harvest.
Oh, yeah, that's another one. One. They were huge when I was growing up as well because of farming.
Yeah.
And it was almost the biggest festival, not in terms of the church year, as Mr. Briggs, as it was known. Reverend Briggs, he introduced us to that. But just in terms of the social life of my home church. The Harvest Festival was immense, and the entire church was decorated, all the windows filled with fresh fruit, veg, potatoes, onions, flowers, it was immense Harvest Festival. So again, finding that is a scriptural thing, that's in the Bible, Harvest Festival, that was awesome for me. And it also, I guess, now that I'm reflecting, I've not thought of this before, but that's probably all part of this way I've ended up doing this sort of podcast, where Christ is involved not just with my private soul and fire insurance, but with everything, the whole creation.
Yeah. We'll keep going with the scenes, but just on that, I was just doing some reading on the Homeric hymn to Demeter. So when you think about harvest and all these kind of stories of why do we have plants and seasons and all that sort of stuff, and then obviously so many worldviews and religions and mythologies, they've got an account of the seed time and harvest. And it's usually something awful, like the one about Persephone is just this young girl who's dancing with her friends in a meadow, and then up comes Hades with his chariot of jet black horses to kidnap her and take her down into the underworld, and then her mom Demeter's wandering around going, "Oh, everything's gone, and I'm all sad," and then eventually she's let out. But the pomegranate seeds, that's an interesting, wasn't it?
Oh, I'm huge on pomegranate.
Persephone gets to eat some pomegranate seeds.
Yes.
Go on, give us a bit on the pomegranate seeds.
I didn't mean to distract. Yeah. It's only because they are traditionally the fruit that was eaten in the Garden of Eden. Certainly the pomegranates on the Tree of Life.
Right.
They are probably the fruits on the Tree of Life, but sometimes they're traditionally understood both the Tree of Life and the knowledge of good and evil are pomegranates, but particularly on the Tree of Life because they're just full of seeds and fertility. But sorry.
No. But it's just so interesting, as we might think about this later on, how the distortion of the truth. You can still see, I mean, literally seeds of the truth that have kind of made its way into the other mythologies of the world.
And to me, that's why the Homeric, if I have to choose between those two sides of Greek, the Homeric or the Platonic Aristotelian rubbish, I would choose the Homeric stuff because there you're still engaging with real stories that have the threads of things that can lead you to genuine biblical ideas. Even that idea with the harvest and there's the Hades, the underworld that comes to, you're like, that's not true, but I there's something we can do with that. Whereas once they go, we don't like all that, let's just have a God who does nothing, and cannot be perceived and says nothing and doesn't care about anything. I'm like, you can't do anything with that, but you can do something with the Homeric stuff.
Yeah, and partly I think because there's a drivenness within story, so characters are motivated, they're desirous of things. And I remember there's a wonderful quote from, I mean, most of the book isn't very good, but it's by a guy called Jeremy Truby who writes a book, this is how to write a screenplay, basically. It's one of those things. And he says, Descartes has I think, therefore I am, whereas story is about I want, therefore I am. So you're a heart-driven creature, rather than you're just this kind of brain on a stick and, there's a thing called consciousness and stuff like that. And stories where people just think are rubbish. You actually need, the stories to be driven by an intention, desire, by kind of passion, and that sort of thing. Let's go. I suppose we've kind of done two scenes already because we've done the 1-year-old in the Harvest Festival, surrounded by this this abundant food, and then we've got you discovering just how big this whole Jesus thing really is with the church calendar with Reverend Briggs. What's another scene that we really ought to see if we were trying to get a handle on you?
I think maybe a good one is Speaker's Corner. That's this thing in central London at it's in Hyde Park, not that far from Buckingham Palace. It's the end of Oxford Street. And Liz and I, even before we were married, we were just students and going out. Then we were engaged and so. But throughout that whole time, we would go. Well, we had this friend called Peter Moody. He was like Jamaican background guy, big. The weird thing is, other than at Speaker's Corner, he was so shy and quiet. But at Speaker's Corner, it's like the Spirit of the living God came upon him, and he preached with such power and authority and deep theology. But we didn't know that at first. He just said, "You should come to Speaker's Corner. Let's tell people about Jesus." And then we were like, "Oh, okay." And then we thought, "Oh, it'll be like just a broad cross-section of the sort of people we talked to as students at university."
Yeah.
And then we went, and it wasn't that. It was like 50,000 Muslim people. This is in the 90s, early 90s. And then, maybe 10,000 other people who were not necessarily Muslim,
Yeah.
and then a very small number of Christians. And then it was chaos. And we went into that and just got exposed as we didn't know what we were talking about when it came to Christian theology. So on the one hand, I got the excitement and the sense of, like, I've read the Bible, read some shit, but to suddenly go from that into this situation where all these Muslim speakers, particularly, who were really had really thought a lot about Christianity from this outside perspective and what they regarded as wrong with it, and going into that, and they put us under enormous pressure for that first year. Like, what is the Trinity? And back then, we would initially just go, oh, well, it's like a mystery, isn't it? Now, that is considered an acceptable answer if you are in Christian circles, because everyone just goes, Whereas that is a rubbish answer.
Yeah.
And they rightly said, you don't know what you're talking about, do you? You don't know what it is. And it was like, yeah, they're right. They're right. I don't know what I'm talking about. I don't know what it is. And they said, so you are coming here. You dare to come here to tell us that you know about God and we don't. And then when we ask you, like, the central questions about your God, you don't even know.
Right.
And I was yeah, that's true. So for those first, I remember quite a lot of weeks, we would go and just get battered, absolutely battered. Questions like, oh, so your God what you're talking about the incarnation, like your God went to the toilet, right? And at that time, I'm like, did he? And they're like, that sounds. And they were rightly putting me under pressure. And then they give me Bible verses from all over the Bible that I never thought about. And I just didn't know. And so we'd go away absolutely destroyed every week. And it'd take us like 2 or 3 days to even like speak because we were so exhausted and wrecked by it. But it was brilliant because it took us about a year before we could stand on our own feet and sort of go, oh, hang on. Okay, I can answer that.
Right.
And that is this. And so that scene then, I think the best scene, if you're going to picture something, is as us as like 18-year-olds, or probably 19 or 20 actually by the time we did that. And just this sense of us totally out of our depth, surrounded by thousands of people asking urgent, relevant, central questions, and us not being able to answer them. And then we discovered, you need to go back to the Bible more seriously and trust that these are the right questions and that the Bible will answer them, not later theologians who, it made us think the Trinity wasn't invented like 300-400 years after the Bible. Like Moses teaches the doctrine of the Trinity, things like that. And then we discovered like nothing less than that would answer these people. So being in a furnace for a year and getting absolutely reduced to tears, really, with exhaustion and defeat, was the best thing. And I often say they were the greatest theological teachers I ever had because they forced me. Because the kind of answers, you go, oh, well, Trinity, have you ever thought of it a bit like this? And they go, but that doesn't make any sense because... And they were right. They were right every time.
So when you were you were kind of skulking off with your sort of tail between your legs, feeling kind of, we just screwed up again there, where were you going back to? Where was the kind of regrouping place that you just got your Bibles open and just went, we've got to really just get
so
this
initially we were students living in student accommodation. Then we got married, and this is when we were like 24, and we were living in Finchley.
Okay.
So we go back there, and then at that time I was teaching Greek at what was then called the London Theological Seminary. Now it's called something else. I can't remember what it's called now, but Dr. Martin Lloyd-Jones helped to set it up for training nonconformist ministers, like in North London. So I taught Greek there. And so that I'd go back there, but and so Liz and I would do that. But the real thing that helped us, and this is like a cheat code, it's ridiculous, really.
Okay.
That when I was doing my PhD at King's College London, and then there was a little announcement, I think it was Alan Torrance or Colin Gunton, had just said, there's an elderly man who has gone blind, and would anyone be prepared to go and read to him from theological books because he's lost his sight? And that was it. That was all that was said. And I was like, oh, wow, yeah, I'd love to do that. And I was just imagining it was just some retired person and, that was it. And it would just be me doing them a favour kind of thing. But I was just like, yeah, I'd be happy to do that. Took it, went to the address. It was Bishop Leslie Newbigin. And he was the person. And week by week, I would go and read. I remember the first book we read was N.T. Wright, The New Testament and the People of God, or something like that.
Okay, yeah.
Maybe it was that. But he got like often pre-publication versions of books and things like that. And then I'd read them. And then he'd go, what do you make of that? And I'd say something stupid. And he'd go, okay, I think it may be this.
Yeah.
And then would give like an unbelievably brilliant analysis of the whole thing. And I'd be just like, yeah, that. But it was so wonderful because he asked me about Speaker's Corner and me doing that. And because he's like, it was tremendous missionary evangelist theologian.
Yeah.
He'd go, so what did you say to that question? And then I'd be like, well, we said this. And he goes, no, that's not a good answer. But he wouldn't tell me the answer. I wanted him to say, this is what I would have said. Yeah. He wouldn't. He'd say, let me tell you where to go to get answers. And he'd say, yes, you need to do the Old Testament. You don't back away from the Trinity. You have to be able to, that's got to be in your shop window. The thing you're most confident, don't stop until that is the thing you're most confident about. And that you're not fearing you're getting a question. You're leading with it. You're leading with it. And you're thinking they're going to be terrified that I'm going to bring up the Trinity sort of thing.
Yeah.
And he said, to do that, you need to go read the Bible, understand how the Bible teaches it, and learn how to do that from the early church fathers, because they were using mostly the Old Testament when they developed the doctrine of Trinity, and see how they did that and understood it, and then you'll be able to do it. And then he listened and guide me and counsel me. But that's how we went from being so crushed. We had this like unbelievably brilliant mentor that was just like this secret thing that the Lord gave us to say, right, you can do this. Don't give up. Go back next week, and then eventually and Jay Smith, everyone knows Jay Smith, he came, he was part of it, and all of us together began to learn how to do this.
That's so fascinating. That the way God arranging his children around and putting them in contact with each other to sort of build each other up, and using that kind of weakness that he couldn't read the book, so he needed some bloke from near Preston to come and read them for him.
It's weird, isn't it?
That's wonderful. Well, I would pay to see this film that we're now going to make. If there's any financial backers who are watching this video, we'll gladly receive your funds to make Paul Blackham the movie happen. But yeah, I just wanted people to really get a sense of your background, and you're obviously, your enthusiasm comes through and in everything you talk about, but just particularly to sort of see how the Lord's been using you in terms of engaging others with the wonders of Christ, and so really appreciate that. Now let's get on to this scheme of this podcast you've got, this Christ-centered cosmic civilization. I'll tell you what really excited me about it was one particular episode. I can't remember which one it was, but it's called A Journey Through the Heavens. Do you remember this?
Oh, yeah.
And you take us through a journey from the earth through the three heavens, through the first heaven, through a second heaven, and then into a third heaven. And even just that language, for so many of us as Christians, feels a bit, where does that come from? Where are you getting that from? But we can answer that question. But I suppose what was so exciting for me was that listening to an episode like that, go back into church, and then just to hear the things that we say as Christians about, Jesus who is at the right hand of the Father, in heaven, just took on a real new kind of depth. And I felt I had a much stronger appreciation for just the shape of reality and the shape of the cosmos. So where are we getting this shape of the cosmos from? What this idea?
Yeah, I mean, people who hang around me a lot, I always think they must groan when I start on my three heavens pitch, because they're like, oh man, he's not doing that again. Because I do it a lot, because to me, I'm like you, I feel it's exciting and it's a bit of a game changer in perception to understand that it's not just like Earth and then some stuff up above. But it's a much more gradiated thing than that, and that the Bible has a more sophisticated view of cosmic reality than that, and that has been deeply understood and populated and depicted by our Christian ancestors for thousands of years all over the world. But how does it work in the Bible? Well, straight in the beginning. In the beginning, God created the heavens, plural, and the earth. Now, straight away, that is missed.
Yeah.
People think of it as heaven, singular, and earth. You can't get into one verse of the Bible with that.
There's quite a lot in that one verse, isn't there?
Yeah, it's like, okay, that's really, there's so much you're going to explode. It explodes with the more you pull on it, and it's all out. But just that thing about heavens, plural, and earth, and that's like that all the way through the Bible. It's heavens and earth, and even in Hebrews, it's like Jesus ascends through heavens in order to get to this control center of the universe. So what then a good way of, like, I'm showing how to go about doing this with their own Bible study, is then look up where the word like heaven and heavens is used in the Bible and how it's used. And that very quickly, I think, shows you why there are these three heavens. Because you've got, like, first of all, the concept of three. The Apostle Paul in, like, 2 Corinthians 13, he goes, I took a trip to the third heaven.
Yeah.
So he's like, of course there are three heavens, and I went to the third one. I might have been in my body, I might have been out my body. I think he was in his body, but that's for another discussion for another time. In body or out of body, he's like, I'm not sure. But he just tells us explicitly third heaven. So,
without any explanation, he just says, I was caught up to the third heaven. And like we're all supposed to go, the third.
Oh, yeah, obviously, of course. Yeah, the third one, Yeah, and so that to me, like, exactly as you articulated it, that was like, oh, so he expects we know what he's talking about. So then why don't we? Well, then I assume all the information was available. Yeah. So I'm like, okay, let's go back and spot it. And then you just notice, even in chapter 1 of the Bible, that there is the birds of the heaven. So there's like an initial kind of heaven, and you'll see that throughout the scriptures. Jesus talks about the birds that are in this heaven, this first heaven, and it's this what we call it atmosphere, our atmosphere, and it's like a little heaven, first heaven. There's clouds. I'm looking at some now. There's blue sky heaven. And then there's winged creatures that fly in the first heaven. And there's clouds of glory. And it's an expansive thing. And when you're up high, even in the first heaven, and you're looking down from a plane or a mountain or even a tall building, it's quite an experience. And you feel, it takes your breath away, and it's overwhelming. Even just the experience of height and grandeur and size of the first heaven. That's that. But then we scale up and go, but there's also something like the stars of the heavens. and the sun, moon, and stars that are in something that's also called a heaven. Now that we go, but that's like ridiculously bigger than the first heaven. Yeah, okay, but notice the scaling.
Yeah.
First heaven, scale up to second heaven. The scaling is enormous, absolutely enormous, and we are quite taken away by the scale of the second heaven, which also has clouds that like nebula that are large and glorious, and then there are creatures that move about like gliding, flying through the heavens. And it's interesting in science fiction that like spaceships again, that's like, but they fly through the heavens, and it's all to do with, it's all very much like the similar language, that is used about the first heaven is actually extrapolated out. So that's this second heaven. Enormous galaxies, stars, all that, creatures that inhabit it. And then for the modern mind, that is where your mind is supposed to get blown. You're supposed to go, the scale of the second heaven, and this.
It's at least 4 times as big as this one. It's massive.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah, it's like really big, and huge numbers are thrown at you, and you're supposed to get sort of a sense of awe and worship about the second heaven. And then people imaginatively populate it with aliens and civilizations and project into it really what are divine, like the idea that there's like higher level beings who live in the heaven, and they could come down and bring us technology or cures or things like that, or possibly judgment from the heavens and all this. So the second heaven becomes the ceiling, really, the highest level that can be thought of. And you're supposed to be, if you're dissatisfied with that, it's like, oh, you haven't understood it. You need to go and see more. You need to see more, like go Carl Sagan or something on the heavens or something, or on space. And just the calling it space is so rubbish.
I love that. Like, you mentioned that in the podcast a couple of times. It's so funny. But sorry, go on, say about
space,
it.
It's just
the
like,
space thing.
It's big, and there's a lot of expanse between the inhabitants. So we're going to focus not on the inhabitants or the light or the grandeur, but the expanse between them, and just say it is essentially just space.
It's mostly nothing. That's the
nothing.
thing. Just like,
so
I wouldn't worry about it, because it's mostly not. Most of the stuff up there isn't stuff at all. It's nothing.
It's so unimaginative. The 20th century's been rubbish about the second heaven. But see, what the Bible does is go, oh, okay, you think that is mind-blowing. Remember the jump in scale from the first heaven to the second heaven, right? Now imagine that there was just such a big jump in scale when you go from the second to the third. And you're like, what? I can't do that. I can't make that imaginative leap. And the Bible's like, I know. But it's there.
Yeah.
It's there. And that's the level. So if you shouldn't be satisfied with being wowed by the second heaven. You should go, what? But there's a bigger jump and scaling up to a level of reality where, and again, now in the third heavens, we're now dealing with clouds again, clouds of glory, expanses, winged creatures flying around, light that's emanating out. And now we're at the source of all light. And even biblical writers who are pretty amazing, and someone like Ezekiel, who's like, oh man, I always think of him like a surfer dude or something, who's dropping acid or something. But he's the sort of person who he has a go. He has a go at trying to describe it. But even he's like, oh man, it's like, wheels and stuff, and I don't know how it works. And John has a go, and they have a go, but you can see... Like, it's very, very difficult to make that imaginative leap and capture it with language and things. But that's an important thing. And it's at that level of reality, the highest level of reality, that is where Jesus reigns. and he is completely competent to handle that level of reality and to administer it with, you know, hundreds of millions of angelic beings, and the angelic beings themselves are too much. And when biblical people come into contact with some of these higher level angels, they just collapse and start worshipping them. Even someone like John does that, and you're like, John, dude, you know you shouldn't be worshipping. Even the angels like, you know you shouldn't be doing this. And John's like, yeah, I know, but you know, you're pretty amazing. So it's that sort of thing. And
just having that sense, because often people show those videos of, you know, look, here's the size of a guy sitting in a park, and then they zoom out a bit and they're like, oh, look how small the guy is compared to, you know, and how big the city is, and then zoom out again and zoom out. And then you've totally forgotten about the guy who was sitting in the park, because you're thinking, like, how he can't be relevant at all. Like, he obviously has no meaning or value because he's so small in the grand scheme of things.
Yeah.
But then one of the really helpful illustrations that you were chatting about with PJ on one of the earlier episodes. So your son PJ, who heads up, it's called the Global Church History Project.
Yeah, Global Church History Project.
Yeah, so you've got Global Church History and the Christ-centered cosmic civilization. All space and time is dealt with by the Blackham family. But what was great in that conversation was you talked about a theatre and how, if you really want to understand what's going on in the massive structure of the theatre, you really need to be sitting in one particular place. And now, just sort of parse that out. What do you mean by that? If you know, the world's a theatre, shouldn't we want to go into space? And
No, I don't think so. I think it's a very hostile environment, quite deliberately.
Right.
It's set up to prevent us doing so. I think it's partly to do with it's the curtain that prevents us accessing, like, the control room of the universe, and that there's like this curtain almost being put down. And it's as if to say, and this problem that you burn up if you start trying to leave the atmosphere and all this sort of thing. It's an immensely hostile environment because the living God's like said, I cannot have people like you wandering around my cosmic civilization. You are really dangerous. I've quarantined you and sealed you into a tiny, tiny portion of it. I've had to exile you into this tiny portion of the cosmic. I have designed it to be our family home forever and ever and ever, but I can't have you doing that right now because you'd be awful. And you've already made a really bad mess, and I don't want that spreading. So no, I think going into space now in our present darkness is not only impossible, of course. Like we think it's an enormous achievement to go to the moon or something, and that's just a tiny satellite that's barely beyond the orbit. And then it's like, what if we went to Mars? And I'm like, yeah, like, maybe you could do that. But think of that, a single solar system in one galaxy. You couldn't we can't even travel to an adjacent star or anything. That's all good. I'm really pleased that that's the case. So, I've lost my train of thought.
But in terms of, being on Earth.
Yes, right.
Looking from the perspective of Earth is the right place to be.
That's the right place to be. And it's the difference between Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy, Douglas Adams, and Psalm 8. So Hitchhikers, the whole series, is designed to make you feel like you're nothing. Life is it's hilarious. I love it. It once said hilarious. It's brilliant. Love it. So many classic things in it. But underlying it all is a philosophy that human beings are nothing and unimportant and irrelevant. And the meaning to everything. 42, deliberately the idea that there is no answer to everything. Although actually 42 is a really significant number, but that's for another time. But
I've just done the episodes on numbers and all that sort of stuff. So multiples of 7 got to be taken seriously. 7,
and it's the number 3.5 actually, because 42 months is 3.5 years. So in the Bible, the 3.5 is half of 7. And so you'll know, like, that's the time that there's the drought in Elijah and in Revelation. Anyway, listen, you're drawing me into it. I shouldn't have done that.
But anyway, Douglas Adams wasn't trying to say anything valuable with that. Yeah.
So he's really what he's really doing is taking a perspective to view cosmic reality from like a disengaged floating one in the second heavens, like just trying to look at it all as if this is the correct way to view it from, like floating around among the galaxies, Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy. And really it's galaxies in that. You can just float around all the galaxies. And that, from that perspective, you will realize you are an insignificant nothing, and there is no meaning. There's no Jesus. There's no God. There's nothing. That's Douglas Adams. What Psalm 8 does is say, oh, well, no, you don't be looking from it. You're not designed. You shouldn't even be going up there anyway.
Yeah.
You definitely shouldn't be trying to view reality from a disengaged floating perspective in the second heaven. You can't do it physically, so don't try and do it imaginatively. It's stupid of you. You have been designed to stand on earth and look up through the first heaven into the second heaven and then have this sense of the third heaven. And when you do that in Psalm 8, what is the perspective of that person? They don't go, wow, when I look up in the heavens, I feel like a worthless nothing. No, you go, wow, how important are we human beings that the one who made this loves us and cares for us so much. And the answer to that question in Psalm 8 is the Son of Man. The Son of Man has done this. Yeah. He rules all this. He's designed all this. He loves us, given himself for us. And I feel like now amazing. I feel loved. I feel like my life has got meaning. I want to serve him and love him. He's the center of reality. And two ways of looking at the stars. One makes you feel worthless. So if people are looking at the stars and feeling worthless, don't do it that way. Go back inside. Don't look up anymore. Go back inside. Read the Bible for a while. Find out about Jesus. Then go back outside and look at it as it was designed to be looked at. So, the theatre point is, you could, if you say, here's a theatre, I'm going to wander around the theatre and look at it from across the street, and it's an enormous building, and look at that, the structure of it, things like that. It's not, you're kind of observing truths about it, but that's not what the theatre's been designed, or you look at it from a hill far away and you get binoculars and you look at the theatre. You can do all those things, but that is not what the theatre has been designed for. It's designed for you to go inside the theatre and actually sit in a very narrow kind of defined space that's inside the theatre. And from that perspective, things will happen in your field of vision, and that will then tell you a story, and suddenly the whole building makes sense. Only, though, if you sit where you're supposed to sit.
Yeah, that's so helpful to realize that we are part of not just a universe or a world of things that can be looked at in any sort of direction, but we're part of a grand theatre of salvation, and that is being kind of played out for us. And I want to kind of have a think about, you mentioned the curtain, and when we get the picture of, what is the shape of reality, when Moses is shown that, and he makes the tabernacle, and so he makes it according to the plan of what he's been shown, and then he's got the holy place and then the most holy place, and that at a certain point, so it's one room, isn't it, and then you add in this thick curtain to separate the two. And one of the things, wrestling with different kinds of stories and mythologies, the idea of a threshold or a barrier, and that so much story and storytelling is about someone crossing through the threshold. So Joseph Campbell's famous hero's journey, you have to go into the unknown, you cross the known world into the unknown, and then you do whatever you do and you get a boon, and then you go back across the threshold. And it seems to me that when we're thinking about the gospel story, because we haven't got this staging sort of idea, that there is a threshold that Christ crosses in the incarnation, at the point of in being conceived by the Holy Spirit, and then he sort of recrosses it at the ascension. And that most Christian churches that I'm ever sort of part of, well, we all celebrate Christmas, we all celebrate Easter, but the Annunciation and the Ascension are completely ignored within the narrative. But on this thing of threshold, then, when you're thinking about the cosmic civilization, where do those thresholds come in, and how should we sort of think about them?
Yeah, it's a good thing, because that idea of, like, if we take it seriously, the tabernacle instructions, and I try to, is that sense that initially this model of the heavens, this multimedia model of the heavens and the earth, if you notice the order in which the instructions are given, initially Moses is told to make 3 pieces of furniture. And that's worth a whole conversation in itself about the Trinity and so on.
Yeah.
But then he's told to make a building, and just make the building, and then sort of, now make sure you've made that according to the instructions. So there's a time to meditate on the fact that it's a single building that is undivided, as you were saying. And then only in the next stage a curtain is put in. So that fundamental idea that when God designed it all, he designed it not to have the division, no division between, not really. Although even in the early creation, you can see that he's anticipating division, because there's the land and the sea, and the land and the sky, and all light and darkness, day and night. He's already establishing these boundaries, because boundary is so important. And then, of course, there's this big boundary is brought in that he didn't design, which he obviously knew it was going to happen, but it wasn't really. It's not part of the design. His great intention is this curtain, and then what that means is our experience of reality is deeply limited, truncated, and we don't perceive lots of the cosmos. So in Colossians, for example, Jesus, everything seen and unseen, powers, principalities, so on, seen and unseen, this idea. And then in 2 Corinthians, Paul again talks about seen and unseen levels of reality. It's all of it has been made by Jesus, for Jesus. It holds together in him. He manages it all. But we need to take seriously that we are so used to, in a post-enlightenment regime, to say the only thing that's real is what is seen. And my reason will operate only on what I can see, and I don't believe that anything beyond what I can see is real or rational or needs to be taken seriously. But the Bible has warned us, no, don't do that, because there are vast aspects of reality that are not seen to you, and that's not a deficiency of reality, that's a deficiency in you, and you're in a mess, you're in this little sealed off kind of fragmentary section at the moment. And you can't see everything that needs to be seen. But it's okay. Jesus has got it all. It's all good with him. And there are powers, kingdoms, principalities, all of that. But we're so used to, in this post-enlightenment, particularly English-speaking world, kind of, although European, say, that sense of we've reduced the limits of our perceptions is the limits of reality to us. Whereas the Bible said, no, don't do that. There is a boundary, and you can't normally see beyond it, but it is there, and there are many different kinds of creatures, angels obviously people could cope with, but many others that you can't see, and it's because of this kind of sense in which a curtain has come down. So sometimes people they'll say, a person can't understand the Bible because a veil is over their eyes. Paul talks about that as well. But it's like, no, you can't. We can't see even reality, the non-biblical book of the cosmos, because there's also like a veil that's written in that you can't see beyond. So is that the sort of thing you were?
Yeah, no, it does, because I suppose we've got this idea of a spatial distance or a spatial boundary and something that's going to stop you going from one thing into the next. And then so much of our most profound myths and stories that culturally we keep on telling are about someone who can cross over. So you've either got, this giant chasm that, can't be bridged by anybody and but who could possibly make it across there and who can go on that journey? But then also people who are considered to be sort of guardians or of portals, so it's quite interesting. What was his name? The actor's name is in the early Thor films. I don't know if you saw any of those first.
Is it
Idris Elba? Yeah. So he's playing Heimdall, I think, and he's like, he's guarding the way back to Asgard. And so if anyone wants to come from Midgard, is that what they call Earth, to Asgard, they've got to go through his portal, and he's guarding the way. And you think, that's a really interesting idea, because there is a cherubim with a flaming sword that guards the way back to the tree of life from when the Lord introduces this barrier between Eden and the rest of the earth. But then what's really odd is how, and this isn't just an MCU kind of complaint, but once they introduced, they were like, multiverse is going to be everything. So now kind of anyone who's got a kind of special watch or a little bit of a power could just move their wrist and make a portal from one world to another. And you're like, well, originally, even in the establishment of a kind of Norse cosmology, it was a really big deal to pass from world to world, and now it's like everyone's just doing it.
I couldn't agree with you more. Like the notion of infinite universes, multiverse, is the most intellectually rubbish idea that has possibly ever come. Because the only reason people think like that is because the model of the universe they have to handle this universe doesn't work. So they'll go, it doesn't work, but if we have infinite number of universes, it maybe works. And you're like, oh, shut up. Why not just say a leprechaun's done it or something? Just come up. I've touched on fake creatures there, but why not just come up with a completely silly fairy story? Because that at least would be more fun. The infinite universes means like I can't be bothered coming up with a genuinely good rational explanation. So I'm just going to do Deus Ex Machina and go, well, I'm just going to go, there's infinite universes and it will be true in one of them. And you're like, you lazy good for nothing. And as you say, it doesn't only ruin science and scientific explanation, because it's so rubbish in that. But it's rubbish for storytelling. Because suddenly you can just do a Deus Ex Machina and you go, I'm just going to go into a different parallel universe where that works. Or, I'll be quiet. Because as you say, with the Midgard, the Thor, the Norse stuff, the Bifrost. Oh my goodness, that's like this crazy thing. And we see the rainbow in the sky, and it's like part of reality in this sense that there's a bridge that reaches into the heavens, and it's immensely difficult to use it. And there's guardians on it, and that was a fantastic idea. And of course, you'll know in the what's it called, the Hellions Gospel. Oh, you know the Hellion Gospel were Jesus. Do you know that it's the evangelistic tool used to win the sort of Germanic peoples, and it was a version of the Gospels written culturally for them. Right. And one of my favourite bits is in the resurrection. Jesus doesn't just come out of the thing. It's like, no, we need something more dramatic than that, and something that'll explain like the rainbow Bifrost thing. So in it, he like blasts. The resurrection is so intense about boom, and then the rock explodes, and such is the intensity of the resurrection, boom, and it creates the Bifrost. And so, all the Germanic people would be like, "Oh, so that's the origin story of the Bifrost. It's the resurrection of Jesus."
So that's the bridge to life diagram we all really need, isn't it? Just a much bigger
that's it. But you see, whether that is truly the origin story for the Bifrost, I think Noah might be "Hey, hang on," but nevertheless, there's a fundamental truth. Like the Germanic people's like, so the way to bridge from Earth to the heavens with the God is this resurrection, and now that's true. That's true. But anyway, you're right. Multiverse,
but that's and so I was reading, started listening to the Andy Serkis read Lord of the Rings. And it's just the stuff that's in there, and they'll say, "Oh," and then they walk for 3 hours. And you're like, what? Just stop. Someone walked for 3 hours. It's like, this is a completely, overlooked part of the quest. But it's like, why would someone walk for 3 hours? Like, there's no travel in these MCU things. It's like you get everywhere immediately. There's no sense of a journey. I mean, at least even the Barbie movie. I mean, I don't know if you've seen the Barbie movie. Yeah. But that does this whole thing about there's a threshold between Barbie Land and the real world. Yeah. You even do have to go through a certain set of instructions one way and then backwards to get onto the Venice Beach boardwalk.
Yeah, right.
And travel across land and sea and genuinely break through from world to world rather than just going, you just jump.
It's so rubbish, isn't it? And as you say, in Middle-earth, there's a whole series of books that were created so people could do role-playing games in Middle-earth, and it's compatible with 5th edition, of course, and Adventures in Middle-earth. And when I read these, it was amazing that one of the main things that you do is rules for journeying. And instead of just having battles and things, there was these enormous rules about you having a journey, and are you discouraged by it, or are your spirits lifted? And most of the playtime is going on journeys because that's what the books are like. The books are about that. So that's what the gameplay is. And that sense that you're journeying from one place to another, and it's complex to do it. And then to go into Moria, and and all that goes on in passing from one into the next, and the dangers, the hazards, and it's not to be done lightly. You do not just go into Mordor and all that sort of thing.
And I was thinking about it with the wood between the worlds in The Magician's Nephew.
Brilliant.
And Lewis even has to set up there a kind of, it's almost like an airport terminal. You've got to kind of come to this one place where you can go from different pools and enter into the different worlds of Charn, or back into Narnia, or back into London, or whatever it is. But at least it's a really cleanly arranged piece of world building. And I think that's one of the things I've found so helpful in your Cosmic Civilization podcast, is that when people really want to get into mythology and storytelling and fantasy and science fiction, so much of it is about the world building.
Yeah.
And I mean, Tolkien never used that sort of language. He was always mythopoeia, because it's the making of the story. But whenever we're trying to kind of establish the lore or the world building of these different fantasy worlds in which people love to live, it really matters that you have these kind of fairly fixed principles, because without them, you just end up with this, desperately kind of naked capitalist, we're just trying to make more money out of everything. It just gets terrible.
I get that. And I'll share this with you and I do it cautiously because it could be misunderstood, but when I was growing up, I thought that I wanted to have a much bigger vision of God. Mm-hmm. And so I obtained books that were like Doctrine of God, or sections of books that were Doctrine of God. And I thought this was going to be brilliant. Mm-hmm. It was going to really enrich me and open my mind and my heart, and reality was going to be improved by this and all that. Mm-hmm. But nearly entirely, I had the opposite experience, because what the Doctrine of God, I'll put that in inverted commas, was in most of the books was something so abstract. It was more like the Hitchhiker's thing. It was something utterly disengaged. No story, no personality, no events. Like in the Bible, getting to know God and the persons of the Trinity, you know, God Most High, the Angel of the Lord, the Spirit who blows, and all this and thing. It's so engaged in events and and speech and encounter and, you know, the world and stars and angels and historic events and battles and crossing a sea and all these sorts of things. But I'm reading that all the time and going, God, this God's amazing and so powerful and wise. Then I turn to Doctrine of God books. By and large, they were supposed to make me like, wow. But nearly invariably as a young person, I was like, that's strangely sterile and really not. And I came away feeling the God of that book is not that amazing. Whereas the God who, say, takes them through the Red Sea, now you might say, that doesn't necessarily seem to take as much power as the God who described in this abstract book. But it was a more amazing God that takes them through this Red Sea with the walls of water on either side and then crashes it down on the Egyptians. That God's like, wow, that's amazing. And we've gone from a land of slavery. Now we're into this wilderness, but of freedom. But now we're traveling with him and he's providing food every day and all that. Now that is a God that wins my heart and makes me cry and worship and everything. Was the God of the abstract, the sort of disengaged, just leaves me cold.
And a great proof that we, as Lewis says, if God is mythopoeic, should we not be mythopathic? So should we not be those who do respond to the story, being created to respond, to be in relationship, and to be swept up into it, and that's what brings about great songs, great anthems, and great worship, is being caught up within that story, which God is using every single tool at his disposal within, you know, his creation to tell us.
And it's within his creation. He's like, the way he tells the stories and does it all is not like asking us to close our eyes and do like a platonic realm of forms. Always the engagement is kind of rooting us in this world and history and things, and that is what actually wins our hearts and minds. And actually, I think that's how God, he intends to live this sort of life and reality with us forever and ever. You know. Anyway, I'm rambling a bit.
No, it's all glorious. It's this is great. Hopefully, it's raising an amen and a hearty hallelujah from the people who are watching. Paul, thank you so much for joining me. Where might people find you? How might they get hold of the Christ-Centered Cosmic Civilization podcast?
I think I shared a link with you that maybe could be shared, but there's also, you can just search for that. It's on Spotify and Google Podcasts and things like that, so that should be obtainable. We also run a thing called the Bible School Show, and we do that. That goes out every Sunday, and I do that with PJ and my other son Jonathan, and that's just some lectures going through all sorts of subjects on Bible, church history, theology, things like that. And then, of course, we do the book-by-book stuff. And you can go to biblicalframeworks.com and look at, we've tackled all these books of the Bible, about 35 books of the Bible for the past sort of 25 years. So I think that's probably, and then there's the St. Crispin's in Highbury. If you want to pop in and see us there, that'd be lovely. But,
absolutely. I mean, there we have it, the number of different ways that you are a fountain of this Christ-centered theology, and just using lots of different ways to make sure that people can just meet him and discover the glory of his kingdom. So, Paul, thank you very, very much for joining me. I'm glad you were here.
Hey, thank you so much. It's been lovely.